For overcoming myths and objections in income properties, it's best to do upgrades as leases roll over. Really? Upgrades in mid-lease won't benefit the owner. You'd be surprised how many people say that in the marketplace. Frankly, it's smart to do the upgrades as soon as possible. Why? Well, number one, would doing the upgrades now allow the landlord to set a lower base year or a lower expense stop for new leases signed? The answer is yes, because the base year or the expense stop, they are dependent upon the level of operating expenses in place at the time the lease is signed. Now, sometimes leases signed before July 1st use the previous year's base year or expense stop. Leases signed after July 1st use the current year's operating expense or base year or expense stop. But the fact of the matter is, the sooner you do the upgrades, the lower those base year or expense stop figures will be. And realize that once a landlord signs a fixed base lease, they're obligated to pay up to that level of expenses for the entire term of the lease, maybe even with cost of living improvement adjustments. Number two, if you're seeking the highest appraisal, it's smart to make sure that the landlord's share of operating expenses is lowered at least a year prior to having the building appraised. Why? Because the appraiser has to see at least a year, ideally 2 years worth of net operating income in order to come to a reasonable expectation of what the building's worth. And so if you just did a whole bunch of improvements and lowered your operating expense, the landlord's share of operating expenses, and increased your net operating income as a result, but then you had the person appraise the building next month, well, the savings would not be on the books long enough to have been reflected in this year's total net operating income. So it wouldn't have matured enough. That's why you have to do these improvements as quickly as possible, so that your window for when you can effectively appraise the building and reflect that new net operating income comes closer. Would lowering operating expenses and or improving tenant comfort and convenience help with tenant retention and attraction? I think the answer is obviously yes. How about this one? How many upgrades would need to be done anyway in the context of tenant fit-outs as a condition for signing new leases? I talked about this earlier in Selling in Six. This idea of withholding improvements until people roll over, that's actually in the landlord's worst interest, because A, when that tenant leaves, a new tenant's going to look at the space, and maybe it's marooned in 1970s or 80s lighting technology, and the first thing you're going to ask is, will you do a lighting retrofit as a condition of us signing a lease, And the landlord's going to have to say yes, probably. Whereas had he done the retrofit in the middle of an existing lease, it would have paid for itself by now through the repurposing of wasted utility dollars that previous tenant sent to its utility, and they wouldn't have had to take it out of the tenant fit-out budget. Number 5, speaking of tenant churn, upgrades help keep tenants happier and better able to pay their rent. And consider the costs you face if the space actually turns over. Or said alternatively, picture how much money you save if the current tenant is so happy there that they renew their lease instead of leaving. Number 1, you've got lag vacancy, looking for a new tenant. Number 2, you've got build-out vacancy, reconfiguring the space for the new tenant. You've got free rent period, which is generally given a few months free rent to induce a longer lease term to be signed by the new tenant. You have the tenant fit-out allowance, which is expressed as usually dollars per square foot to make the space appropriate for the new tenant. You've got the leasing commission, unless you have the work done entirely in-house and don't cooperate with any other broker. You've got legal, accounting, and more. And when you take a look at all these expenses, holy cow, it's definitely in the landlord's best interest to minimize churn, because doing so gets rid of all 6 of these expenses that are listed here and more. Plus, there's less perturbation in the building, less disruption, less wear and tear in common areas as people move in and out less. Less disruption to other tenants with moving trucks blocking the loading docks and things like that. So there are lots of psychological, sort of non-financial benefits to maintaining long-term tenants as well.